Okay, hello. Uh, in the previous video, I have coded some up to this. Up- okay, I just explain this procedure first. So this is video about some coding into the initiated status. So the flow is like this. I have already explained in last video, but still I'm gonna explain this. This is a payment controller. When we receive the initiate when we receive the API call for initiated transaction, the payment controller maps it to a function. Let's go to the payment controller. So here is, first we have to create a transaction. It gives us the transaction reference. Then to pass this transaction, the transaction reference is here, and the initiate when this type of endpoint comes, the controller maps it to here, to the initiate transaction, which receives the transaction reference from the path as a path variable by using the annotation path variable, and we are sending some initiated transaction request. I have explained this, that initiate transaction request must be the same as the create payment request of the Stripe provider. So we have created this class here, the success URL, cancel URL, and the line items. As this request is in JSON, so request body is needed here. Then this payment service calls the initiate transaction. Controller calls the initiate transaction of the payment service. So this is, so as we see, I have explained this, that payment controller goes to the payment service, then payment service to initiate the transaction. So first initiate transaction. So first aim of the initiate transaction is update the payment status to initiated. So to update the payment status to initiated, we need the row in the transaction table to which we have to update the payment status to initiated. So we have the transaction reference, which uniquely identifies each entry in the transaction, so transaction table or each transaction. So we have to retrieve first the uh, tuple from transaction table or the entity from transaction table by providing the transaction reference. That means this is the transaction reference. Now we need the transaction details of this transaction reference. So for that so to retrieve the entity from the transaction table based on this transaction reference, we have created one method inside the transaction DAO, that get transaction by transaction reference, for which we have given the input as transaction reference. So we called it from payment service and retrieves that transaction entity from here. Here we got the entity. Then next we have to call this payment status service, but payment status service receives the input in the form of transaction DTO. Yes, it needs the object of transaction DTO. So this transaction entity must be converted to the transaction DTO. So this was the issue in the last video. So let's solve this. So here I am inside the payment service implementation, this initiated transaction. So we receive the transaction reference and the request here. Then Okay, this is the call, that call to payment status service. But before that, we need a transaction, we need the entity. So we have created here, sorry, see this. So we have created the get transaction by reference inside the transaction DAO. Let's go to the implementation class. Yes, get transaction by reference. Here we give the transaction reference as the input, and this is our update query. Oh, instead of update, we can say it fetch query. Yes, FETCH, fetch query. Copy it, paste it. Okay, we are not updating, we are just fetching the entity. So string the fetch query, the query is select star from payments dot transaction, where transaction reference is equal to transaction reference. This is the named parameter. We have used name parameter, so here we are injected the object of name parameter JDBC template. Then we have to set the parameters. So map SQL parameter source is used, and we have add the transaction reference. Set this transaction reference named parameter to this value, transaction reference. Then return JDBC template dot queried for object. Query for object method is for select type of queries, to for fetching the entity from the table. So first parameter is fetch query, then okay, first parameter is fetch query. Then second is in the query what we have to do, we have to put the parameters. So this replaces this transaction reference to this value, okay, this named parameter to this value, and then returns this transaction entity. What is transaction entity? It is an object of bean property row mapper type of transaction entity, and it returns this entity. So we are receiving it. Let's save it. We are receiving it here, and we are saving it inside the object of transaction entity. Next, now we have to map this. We are receiving transaction entity, but see in the transaction entity, so this is the okay, let's take it from transaction entity. So this is our transaction entity. Okay, and the transaction DTO. Copy this. So this is our transaction. So this is transaction entity, this is transaction DTO. See here, this is payment method ID, and here the string payment method, provider ID, provider, and type ID, and here type, and status ID, Yes. These four parameters are differ in types. So we need to add the converters for it at the time of create transaction. We needed to map transaction DTO to transaction entity. So we have mapped it, we have added the converters for that, but now we want this entity to DTO transaction. We have to convert this transaction entity fields to the DTO. So for this I have added ID to name, because see here the payment ID is so in the transaction entity the payment method ID is 1, and here in the payment method there is a string. Next, in the for the provider ID the ID is 1, and in the transaction DTO the provider is Stripe. Then payment type ID, here is 1, here is sale. Then the transaction status ID 1 for created, then 2 for initiated, then 3 is for pending, like that. So we have to convert these integers into the string. So I have created this ID to name. So previously we have this package name to ID, in which we have added this payment method enum converter. For that we have created the enums, this payment method enum, this payment type enum, provider enum, transaction status enum. This is enum, that means we combine this one and created, means integer and string, and combinedly gives it a name created. So we can retrieve this one by using from ID, and we can retrieve this created by using from name. So these are the enums we have created. Then this is the converter to convert string. See, the input is string and gives it maps it to integer. This was used in create transaction, where we have to convert this source into the integer to save inside the database, because database needed the integer values. So we passed the string as APM created. For transaction status use case we have pass created and get the integer 1. So this is the converter is always a one-way converter. So this converter is for string to integer conversion. So like this we have created the 4 converters, and now we need actually we need this ID to name, because we are retrieving from the database, and inside the database there are IDs, and to we have to convert it into the DTO, and as we know DTO has the strings. So I have created this package ID to name for the converter, and here see I have named it as integer to payment method enum converter. So which extends this abstract converter. Abstract converter is use to for this conversions. So next, this convert method. So I'm passing the integer as an input here and getting the string by using this payment method enum dot from id the source. That means, for example, the payment method is APM. So here for APM the ID is 1, so I'm passing here 1. So if I pass here 1, or we can say if 1 is here input, then payment method enum dot from id1 from id1 dot get name. Okay, dot get name. That means for 1 there is a name APM, so it returns the string APM. So like this I have created these 4 integer to converters and added inside this util dot converter id to name package, and inside this app config. So in at the time of create transaction, we have created these converters for string to integer conversions. So in the same way I have created these for I have created, okay, let's put it at a 2 as a 2 line because it goes easy for reading. Okay, let's save it. So in the same way I have created these 4 converters here. See, converter integer string, the source is integer and we want the destination, means we want a string. This integer to payment method converter, and it just created the object of integer to payment method enum converter. So like this I have created 4 objects for all that for all those 4 integer to converters, integer to string converters. And then see here, in the case of create transaction, for converting transaction DTO to transaction entity, that means string to integer, we have used this add mappings. Add mappings method of the model mapper is also a one-way method, so we cannot combine the other code inside this. So we have to create separate method so that that method will convert the transaction entity into the transaction DTO. So I have added here I have added here this model mapper dot add mapping method for, see, new property map. This is the source and this is the destination. Source is transaction entity. This time we want to convert the transaction entity into the transaction DTO, and inside this configure, see, using integer to payment method enum converter, this is nothing but the object of the integer to payment method converter we just created here. So using this dot map, what to map? Source dot get payment method ID. The transaction entity is the source, and the source entity has the integer fields, right? And the name of the fields are method ID, ID word is added here. So source dot get payment method ID, and need to map into destination, that means the transaction DTO dot get payment method. name of the field is payment method, so get payment method. So get this and put it inside this into the transaction DTU, the equivalent string name of that. So like that we have added this 4 mappings inside the app config. Let's save it. Let's go back. Okay. Payment service implementation. Okay. Payment service implementation. Save. Okay. See here, we received the transaction entity. Then now we have all the converters and we have done the mappings inside the app config, and for using that model mapper we have to inject it. So this is the injection, and then so this, in this way we can map. So transaction DTO, this object model mapper dot map transaction entity, we have to map this transaction entity we just received here as a response of the get transaction by reference, and convert it into the transaction DTO dot class. So here all the mappings, that all the IDs in the transaction entity goes map into the equivalent strings inside this transaction DTO. Now this transaction DTO, inside the transaction DTO, the status was created. Yes. The status was created. Now we have to update that status to initiated. So the transaction status enum dot initiated, that means, and dot name. So we retrieve the name of the initiated enum and saved it into the transaction status, and then we set this transaction status by using set transaction status, and we are passing this transaction status. So now the payment status or transaction status inside the transaction DTO is updated to initiated. This is updated inside this object, not in the database. Next we have to call our next layer is payment status service layer. So here we go inside the process payment. Let's go into the implementation class. Here see, we pass the transaction DTO. This we are retrieving the transaction status, that is nothing but the initiated now, and converts it into the enum. So we are converting it into the enum because the get status processor, this get status processor requires the enum, right? For that we are converting this transaction, we are creating the enum object of the transaction status by retrieving the transaction status of the transaction DTO. Yes. Then so we took this enum object and pass it to the get status processor. So now inside this transaction status processor is the total enum, that 2 and initiated. So let's go to the get status processor. Here it retrieves the transaction status enum, that is nothing but 2 initiated. So what is the status is initiated. So it gives the object of initiated status processor back to us, and this we saved it into the status processor. Yes. Next, if the status processor is null, then it will throw the exception. Otherwise otherwise what? Now this is the remaining part. See, here we retrieved the initiated status processor object, and now we have to call that initiated status processor. So here inside the status processor we got the object of the initiated status processor, and with that initiated status processor we are calling the process status of initiated status processor. Now here what we have to do, we have to call the transaction DAO layer. Okay, caps lock is on, sorry. We have to call the transaction DAO to update the status in the database. So let's see, we have to call the transaction DAO here, and for the transaction DAO we need the transaction entity. Let's see the transaction DAO. Here is the transaction DAO, and here we need to create one this we have to create this method for updating the transaction inside the database. So this is, I have created this method update transaction. Let's go inside the implementation class. Here we need to implement and add unimplemented. Yes, so this is our now update transaction. See, but before that we have to pass the transaction entity to transaction DAO. Yes, here the input must be the transaction entity. So let's go back. Here we have to call the transaction DAO so that okay, let's go to the created transaction created what the name is, created status processor. Okay, let's go back. Okay, here we need to call the method of transaction DAO. So make sure that you have injected the transaction DAO here, and for constructor injection we have to use the required Rs constructor of the Lombok. Control Shift O, save. Okay, so transaction DAO. So here we need to call what, transaction DAO dot update transaction status. Okay, let's update the name of this. Let's go to the transaction DAO, update. Okay, update transaction status by update transaction status details by transaction reference. Okay, so this is our name of the method. Let's copy it. Let's go to the implementation class and let's update the name here too. Save it. Let's go back, and here we need to call update transaction status details by transaction reference, and for this we need the object of transaction entity. Save it. So this transaction entity we need to form it here. So transaction entity is equal to, now we have this transaction DTO object and we just need to convert it into the transaction entity. So use the model mapper, and for using it we have to inject it to the constructor. So be sure to make it final. So map here, the object of the model mapper is model. Yes, it is done. Transaction entity, this object model mapper dot map. What we have to map? The transaction DTO to transaction entity, so that we can pass it to the this entity. So let's add some log information so that we can see what is happening here. So go inside the update transaction status details by transaction reference. So what we need to do here, we need to add here, or this is our transaction DAO layer. So this is our repository layer. So this directly updates, directly applies the changes, directly does the changes inside the database. So for communicating with database we need its language, so that is SQL. So we need the SQL query for updating this. So I have already yes, see, I have given here the whole information about our transaction table, about our transaction entity, about our declaration of this method, and told it that we need to update the transaction table inside the database. So we have to set the value to transaction status ID by reading this field. So in short, we update, the query should be must like this: update the payments dot transaction, means update this table, but what to set? Set the transaction status ID. We have to set the value of the transaction status ID by reading the fields, and we are providing the field inside the transaction entity. So they just have to retrieve, we just have to retrieve the field transaction status ID and transaction reference from this entity. And to retrieve this, we know we can use this get method. So the query is update table, set transaction status ID to this ID, and where transaction reference to this reference. We have formed this query. now we have to set these parameters. So transaction status ID, from where we get this transaction status ID? We have the transaction entity object. So transaction entity dot get transaction status ID. This retrieves the status ID and adds this inside this query by using the map SQL parameter source. Yes, and in the same way we retrieves the transaction reference from the transaction entity object as dot get transaction reference, and we are returning JDBC template dot update. We are performing update method. Yes, at the time of create transaction we also use the update method of JDBC template to save the details inside the database. That means for insert, for update, or any type of updates, we have to use this update method of the named parameter JDBC template, and we have to pass first the query and the parameters, and it returns the integer. It returns integer means it returns number of rows updated. See, it returns the number of rows updated. In this case we only updating one row, so it returns 1. So let's take this code and update it inside our here string. Let's say it update query. Save it. So update query, update payments dot transaction table. Payments is nothing but our database name. Set transaction status ID to this ID and transaction reference to the transaction reference. So here the name of the object is, caps lock is on, entity, transaction entity. So let's set the parameters by using the get transaction status ID method of transaction entity and get transaction reference and pass it to the update method. Okay, pass it to the, oh sorry, we need this name of the query. Paste, save. So we are passing this query with the parameters. Save. What is the error here? Type mismatch cannot convert from int to transaction entity. What it means? Change method return type to integer. Yes, save it. So the return type is what? Integer. Okay, integer. Let's save it. Let's go back. Let's update here. Integer. Let's save it. Let's go inside this here. Okay, let's remove this null. Let's save it. So we are returning the integer. That means we are returning the number of rows updated. So let's go back here. Let's do some log info. Before that, here we have to create one integer. number of rows updated, number of rows updated number, which is equal to, or we can say number of rows updated. Save it. So log.info, that number of rows updated in db. Save it. Save it. Yes, then we are returning the transaction DTO, the updated transaction DTO. Then let's go back here, response from status processor. The response is okay. Okay, let's save it and let's check it. So shoot. So here transaction initiated. So let's check. See, number of rows updated in database 1. Let's check it inside the database. Let's refresh it. Refresh and shoot this again, query, and let's see that 4. Yes, transaction status ID is now 2. 2 means initiated. So this has been successfully updated inside the database. So this was the pending material from previous video. So here let's go back here. Yes, now we are returning transaction initiated for payment service IMPL, response from status processor and response from payment status service initiation. Okay, let's go back to the payment controller. Okay, it returning the response. So what is the response here? Yes, transaction initiated for transaction reference. Payment service. Okay, let's go back. Let's go to the process payment. Okay, this response from status processor transaction DTO. This transaction DTO we are giving back to here. This is response from payment status service after initiation. The response is like this: status is initiated. After that, this return the so here return the transaction DTO response. Save. Save it. Yes, the return type should be now transaction DTO here. So save it. Let's go to its parent. Okay, okay, okay. Okay, here transaction DTO. So we have to update the payment service. Transaction DTO, save all. काय म्हणत आहे हा import. Okay, 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 okay. Let's go to the implementation. Return type is incompatible with initiate transaction string. Okay, save. Okay, what we need to give back. So this is, we are yes, we send. Okay, for this, okay, let's get a string, save it. It's implementation class. Let's get string, save. We are returning this, save this. Now for checking, we need to start the Stripe provider service also, na. So open project, it's a run as, okay, let's open it. Okay, run as Spring Boot app. Okay, it started. So now let's, yes, it is started. So first start this create transaction, we update this user ID. Okay, send this. Transaction status is created. So we have created this. Now inside this initiate transaction, it should call to the Stripe provider. Yes. So this is our now the reference initiate. Send it. Has been initiated successfully. See, okay. Okay, this has been done. The first work has been done, that we have updated the transaction status as initiated inside the database. So after that, what we have to do is, see, the first work is completed, that this we received the transaction reference and we received the API call to this initiate transaction API and received the transaction reference which was created by the create transaction. And the first work has been done, that we updated the status as the initiated inside the database. Yes. Now what we have to do next, we have to place the HTTP call to the create payment API of the Stripe provider service. So this is our next work that we make to we need to place HTTP call to create payment API of Stripe provider service. So how to do that? In the when we are coding for the Stripe provider service, we used one concept or we use the centralized concept, as we have created one class as HTTP service engine for placing the HTTP call. And inside this HTTP service engine, we received the HTTP request, and for this HTTP request we have created a separate POJO class for HTTP request and for forming this HTTP request we have created another service class, that is nothing but the helper class, that HTTP or we can say we named it as a create payment helper. So here we rename it as initiate payment helper. So we have to create this inside the implementation of implementation class, which helps to forming the HTTP request. And after forming that HTTP request, we set the values, and next, for making the HTTP call, we need to use the REST client. REST client is an interface which is inside the Spring Boot starter web itself, so we don't need to import any package for that, or so we need to build the object of the REST client. So this is the concept of HTTP service engine. So here is our initiate transaction. So this initiate transaction puts request to this HTTP service engine so that it can form all the HTTP related work, and then it make calls to the Stripe provider service. Then it calls to the Stripe provider service. Stripe provider has create payment API. Stripe provider has create payment API. So let's do it in the next video. that this initiate transaction will pass the request to the HTTP service engine. It first forms the HTTP request, and with that HTTP request it passes the HTTP request to this HTTP service engine, so that it can place the call to the create payment API of the Stripe provider service. So it uses for that the REST client. So I'll explain it in the next video. Okay, now for now we have updated this inside the database. So the one aim of the initiate transaction is done. So let's do the HTTP service engine concept in the next video. Thank you.